In the previous installments of this series, we took 2 steps forward and talked about actual socialists and socialism. But now I'm afraid we must take 3 steps back and go back talking about liberalism once more. More specifically, classical liberalism. Within the study of English economics of the late 1700s, we find the works of 2 pivotal figures known as Adam Smith and Dave Ricardo. Smith was born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland in 1723, a small fishing village near Edinburgh, and at the age of 4 it is said that he was spirited away by a band of gypsies. The village would come together to rescue the young boy, and in hot pursuit, they abandoned him before fleeing. He would have made a poor gypsy, wrote Scottish journalist John Ray. At the age of 15, Smith attended the University of Glasgow, where he would be heavily influenced by Francis Hutchinson's philosophical works. 6 years later, he would return home with the support of the jurist and philosopher Lord Henry Holmes Keynes. Smith would go on to get a job as a public speaker, teaching people a variety of subjects ranging across the humanities. Adam Smith is regarded as the founding father of the study of capitalist political economy. Known mostly for his work, The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, he also wrote a lesser-known but equally as important philosophical text titled The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In his theory of moral sentiments, Smith analyzes morality as well as the duality of man, in which on one hand being driven by self-interest, and on the other hand being capable of great self-control, empathy, and reason. Smith made an important observation in regards to the selfish nature of the rich, an observation that he would go on to repeat in his Wealth of Nations. By preferring the support of domestic industry, and directing that industry in such a matter as its produce may be of greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than he really intends to promote it. Effectively, what he's saying here is that within the market, through individual actors pursuing their own self-interest in pursuit of private enrichment, the so-called captains of industry, more wealth is created than if they were to act in accordance to trading for the public good. And at the time, it seemed like a rational enough observation, since in Smith's day, capitalists actually were a progressive force, since unlike landlords, capitalists actually ran businesses that produced goods and services that people could utilize while providing the general public with jobs. Interestingly enough, in Smith's work, Book 5, one can find sprinkles of historical materialism within it, as Smith talks of societies evolving in stages, from a rude state of hunters to a second stage of nomadic agriculture, to the third stage of feudalism and the fourth stage of commerce. He also notes how each of these economic stages gave rise to institutions utilized to reproduce their corresponding economic relations. In the age of hunters, since there was no property, there was no magistrate or state presence, and as humanity has passed through these economic stages, the magistrate has taken on various forms to accommodate the needs of the corresponding economic modes. In other words, Smith recognized that the state, or the police, military, bodies of armed men, etc., existed to protect the powerful from the powerless, or those who have some from those who have none at all. And in light of these observations, Smith does not seem to be a very big fan of this dialectical relationship. In fact, through Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he almost seems to repudiate the inherent coercion, exploitation, rent-seeking, and gross income inequality that coincides with class society in general. As soon as the land of any country has become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they have never sowed, and demand a rent even for its natural produce. All for ourselves and nothing for other people seem, in every age of the world, to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. The interest of the dealers, however, is always in some respects different from, and even opposite to, that of the public. To widen the market and to narrow the competition is always in the interest of the dealers. To widen the market may frequently be agreeable enough to the interests of the public, but to narrow the competition must always be against it, and can serve only to enable the dealers, by raising their profits above what they would naturally be, to levy for their own benefit an absurd tax upon the rest of their fellow citizens. It comes from an order of men whose interests is never actually the same with that of the public. who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have, upon many occasions, both deceived and oppressed it. Wherever there is great property, there is great inequality. For one very rich man, there must be at least 500 poor, and the affluence of the few supposes the indigence of the many. The affluence of the rich excites the indignation of the poor, who are often both driven by want and prompted by envy to invade his possessions. It is only under the shelter of the civil magistrate that the owner of that valuable property, which is acquired by the labor of many years, or perhaps many successive generations, can sleep a single night in security. There are also frequent times in his work where he voices the requirement for workers to be well compensated, hence the classical liberal idea of trade being mutually beneficial to all, that is, the worker trading their labor for a wage. Our merchants frequently complain about the high prices of British labor as the cause of their manufactures being undersold in foreign markets, but they are silent about the high profits of stock. They complain of the extravagant gain of other people, but they say nothing of their own. The high profits of British stock, however, may contribute towards raising the price of British manufactures in many cases as much, and in some perhaps more, than the high wages of British labor. A man must always live by his work, and his wages must be at least sufficient to maintain him. They must even, upon most occasions, be somewhat more. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to bring up a family, and the race of such workmen could not last beyond the first generation. In light of this, Smith's idea of a free market mirrors nothing in common with the modern libertarian or neoliberal conceptualization of the term. What Smith, like the other classical economists of old, meant by a free market is a market free of rentiers, or rather a market free from rent-seeking. A free market where individuals are free to act in accordance to their own self-interest, labor for themselves, live for themselves, and as long as there's no exploitation going on, as long as trade is taking place between legally equal entities, as long as nothing goes to waste and both parties benefit equally from the transaction, that the best societal outcomes could be achieved. Keep in mind that back in Smith's time, Europe was still making its snails crawl out from feudal economic relations, and unlike capitalism, where exploitation is hidden by the contract of wage labor, in feudalism, the baron, or landlord, directly collects rents and taxes from his subjects in the form of their produce or raw bullion. And while the classical economists were, for all intents and purposes, liberals, meaning they were believers in capitalism, to be a capitalist back in those days actually meant to be a progressive and essential actor in the economy, for back in those days, capitalists actually ran and managed firms that produced useful goods and services that people needed. Nowadays, we live in a highly centralized capitalist system, where all investments and business activity is done through the context of finance capital and the juggling of trade or financial instruments, all in pursuit of squeezing and exploiting the general public for as much as they possibly can get without giving anything back in return. In other words, Adam Smith's greatest nightmare has been realized. The capitalist system that we have today is such a massive far cry from what the classical economists were in favor of that they would be spinning in their graves with the centripetal force of Jupiter right now if they knew about the current state of affairs with the stock market, an institution which produces nothing, which is a system for and by rentiers, where the ultra-wealthy make millions of dollars betting on whether or not people are able to pay their credit card debt, or whether or not a given company will survive the second quarter, or speculating on the price of critical life-supporting goods, where money is traded for its own sake and fraud is a business model, where every recession the government directly subsidizes the losses of the rentier class at the expense of the taxpayer decade by decade. But I digress. Let us now move on to Dave Ricardo. Ricardo, born April 1772 in London, was an English economist who was most famous for a number of economic observations, from his theory of rents to his iron law of wages, the falling rate of profit, and his own labor theory of value. Ricardo entered into the business of the stock exchange with his father, who had made a fortune on the London stock market. Ricardo went on to be a highly successful and talented stock exchange worker, earning him the favor of his banking house, and would go on to amass a fortune of his own, which allowed him to pursue his educational endeavors. In 1799, he became interested in the study of political economy after reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and after the next decade would go on to study economics and write an econ book of his own titled The High Price of Bullion, a Proof of the Depreciation of Banknotes in 1810. Ricardo adhered to a kind of laissez-faire doctrine of capitalism, believing that any attempts to uplift the working poor and improve wages were an exercise in futility as postulated by his iron law of wages, though the term itself was coined by LaSalle 70 years later. The iron law of wages stated that all attempts to improve the real income of workers were futile, and that wages perforce remained near the subsistence level. The reasoning for this is that effectively, if workers' wages were raised, then demand for, and by extension the prices of consumer goods on the market, would increase as well proportionally. That is, to compensate for the lost profits due to paying out higher wages. The iron law of wages would go on to be an assumed law by Ferdinand Lassalle as well as Ricardian socialists in the following decades, only to be promptly refuted by Marx in his work, Value, Price, and Profits. In Ricardo's following work, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, written in 1817, he postulates that the economy can be divided between three classes, that is, the workers, the owners of capital, and the landlords, and that the proceeds of production are divided between wages for the workers, profits for the capitalists, and rents for the landlords. In his book, he concludes that profits are inversely correlated with wages, as well as the price of necessities, and that rents are inversely correlated with population size. Let us now talk about the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value itself finds its origins amongst the works of both Smith and Ricardo as an explanation for the source of natural prices, or market equilibrium prices of commodities. While Smith's LTV posits that labor is the original source of all value for commodities, and that the more labor is utilized in production, the greater the value of that item relative to others on the markets. The value of a commodity, or the quantity of any other commodity for which it will exchange, depends on the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its production, and not on the greater or less compensation which is paid for that labor. Ricardo's LTV, on the other hand, asserts that in addition to the labor imbued in commodities, that the relative scarcity or abundance of raw materials harvested from the earth and utilized in production also contributed to the value of commodities. Possessing utility, commodities derive their exchangeable value from two sources, from their scarcity and from the quantity of labor required to obtain them. There are some commodities, the value of which is determined by their scarcity alone. No labor can increase the quantity of such goods, and therefore their value cannot be lowered by an increased supply. Ricardo built heavily on the work of Smith, expanding upon many of his observations and ideas, narrowing down and explaining specific subjects in greater detail, and through his political studies and theories, as well as the acknowledgments by the classical liberals that labor is the source of all wealth, controversial conclusions can be drawn. We will discuss these implications in a moment. For now, let us finally speak of John Locke. John Locke, born in 1632, was a British philosopher and medical researcher, most famous for his works, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding and The Two Treatises of Government. Throughout his philosophical essays, Locke influenced many Enlightenment-era thinkers, from Bertrand Russell to Voltaire to Rousseau, and many others. Locke is famous for refuting the divine right of kings to rule and asserting that we are born with natural rights that must be upheld by the sovereign, and if the sovereign fails to uphold our natural rights, that is, the right to life, liberty, and property, that the citizens have every right to establish a new sovereign in its place. In Articles 24, 25, and 26 of Locke's Two Treatises of Government, where he discusses the natural rights of man, he speaks on the product of the earth being nobody's property except the man who has imbued it with his labor. Locke argues that nobody is entitled to another man's labor except the laborer himself, and after drawing resources from nature and utilizing them, that man has the right to prosper from the fruits of his own labor. God, who hath given the world to men in common, hath also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. The earth and all that is therein is given to men for the support and comfort of their being. And although the fruits it naturally produces, and beasts it feeds, belong to mankind in common, as they are produced by the spontaneous hand of nature,
And nobody has originally a private dominion exclusive to the rest of mankind in any of them, as they are thus in their natural state, yet being given for the use of men, there must of necessity be a means to appropriate them some way or other before they can be made of use, or at all beneficial to any particular man. Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself, the labor of his body and the work of his hands. We may say all properly his. Whatever then he removes out of the state of nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with it, and joins to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. For this labor, being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joins to, at least where there is enough, and as good left in common for others.
And thus, if man's labor is his own property, and property rights are natural rights, and if rent-seeking is a violation of the property rights of others, and the product of the earth is the common heritage of humanity, then one could make a reasonably strong case against private property itself within such a moral framework. Since wage labor, like rents, is a form of unearned, unpaid proceeds going into the pockets of those who reap where they have never sown. And if workers are entitled to the proceeds of their own labor, it therefore logically follows that a system of private ownership cannot exist in order for a truly free society to exist. And it is in this way that within the context of classical liberalism, that actually existing classical liberalism has never existed, ironically enough. Since in order for classical liberals' free market to be achieved, it could only be done so in an economy where all the firms were jointly owned by the workers, and where everyone enjoys the full proceeds of their labor, and no surplus value extraction is taking place. And it is through these observations, as well as the Lockean principles of natural rights, that socialists would come along in the following decades and centuries to take said observations and rationale to their logical conclusion. Ricardo himself, despite being a liberal capitalist, inspired a left tendency of his own through his study in theories known as Ricardian socialism, a kind of Proudhonism predating Proudhon himself. Ricardian socialists were in favor of a kind of free market socialist economy with minimal regulations, free trade, where firms were cooperatively owned, etc. Marxism derives a great deal of its political and economic groundwork from Smith and Ricardo's classic economic texts and analysis, as Marx would come along to make his own observations and contributions to the realm of study. Of course, with a much stronger scientific foundation, since dialectical materialism transcends idealism and utopianism, two pitfalls that well-intentioned thinkers have been tripping into for literal centuries. And it is this scientific method of political analysis that allowed Marx to make his critiques of capitalism. Effectively, what Marx did was take the works of two of the most lauded economists by liberals and used their works to prove that capitalism is an inherently contradictory, crisis-prone, inequitable, wasteful, and inefficient system, and that the very rent-seeking behavior that the classical liberals despise is a built-in component of it. As a result, the field of economics would make its departure from much of the original analysis done by Smith and Ricardo, since now their economic analysis combined with Marxian analysis led to some very inconvenient political implications for the capitalist system as a whole. And thus, the study of economics today has largely been detached from the real world. The labor theory of value has been replaced with marginal utility, the theory of crisis replaced with the great moderation, and the falling rate of profit swept under the rug. And suddenly, what was once a scientific analysis of political economy, as practiced by Smith, Ricardo, and Karl Marx himself, has been replaced with a kind of dogmatic, pseudo-religious optimism. And mainstream economists are now oftentimes the clergymen of the capitalist system, tasked with reinforcing said optimism either through euphemisms used to soften the impact of stated contradictions, or by using bourgeois metrics to measure economic success. Suddenly, an economic crisis is known as a simple market correction. Yay! Sounds much more easing to the ear than a crisis, doesn't it? Especially when you consider that each and every time one of these corrections occur, people's wages are cut and countless people lose their jobs and have their livelihoods destroyed. Suddenly, when corporations dump pollution into the environment, It's just an externality. Nothing too serious. Did we cut down a third of the Amazon? No worries, just a simple externality. And whenever there is a public health crisis leading to a rise in depression or bipolar disorder, all of a sudden, that's a good thing. Well, at least economically, because it increases GDP due to the increased public spending on psychiatric medication. Suddenly, wars and crime are a good thing. Well, at least economically, because it means more jobs for police, prisons, soldiers, and construction contractors. And more jobs means more spending means more growth, and by extension, more success as lauded by modern bourgeois economists. It is in this way that modern economics is largely an abstraction away from the real world. No longer a scientific field of study, but instead a doctrine used to obfuscate the contradictions and to justify ruling class hegemony in the system as is. All of the fallout that occurs in the wake of this system, rather than being studied and addressed, is now swept under the rug and ignored, or described with euphemistic semantics, or sometimes even spoken of in a positive light. And until we Marxists are able to break into the mainstream and reach the masses once more and guide them out from the apathetic darkness of capitalist realism and towards the path to scientific socialism, well, let's just say things are not about to change anytime soon.